Welcome to The Call, an exclusive conversation hosted by the Chamber's Global Intelligence Desk. We're delighted you are able to join us. Please note the views of our guests today are not necessarily those of the Chamber, but we hope you will find those views as valuable as we do. Please feel free to put questions into the Q&A at any time, and we'll address as many as we can after the interview. Let's get started. Good morning. My name is Jay Sapsford, Senior Vice President at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce here in Washington. We are delighted you could join us for The Call, a new forum brought to you by the Chamber's Global Intelligence Desk. The Call is designed for you, our members, to navigate some of the toughest geopolitical issues of the day. Here is the question of the moment. What will Mexico's constitutional reforms mean for the country's business environment? September has been a significant month for our neighbor to the south. Mexico's new Congress was seated on September 1st, with the Morena party of Andrés Manuel López Obrador commanding large majorities in both chambers after winning big in recent elections. But AMLO, as the president is known, does not hand over power to his successor, Claudia Sheinbaum, until next month. That has given AMLO all of September to advance a package of reforms that includes an overhaul of the courts, making all judges subject to popular vote, the weakening or eliminating of independent government agencies, bolstering state enterprises at the expense of the private sector, and a slew of other reforms in sectors from energy to agriculture. Now, some reforms have already passed Congress, with lawmakers saying these changes are needed to root out corruption and to protect the interests of the nation. Other Mexicans have been protesting, saying the reforms will concentrate too much power in the presidency and erode checks and balances. Meanwhile, businesses are wondering, can they settle disputes in a politicized court? What will President-elect Sheinbaum do once she takes office? And what does all of this mean for Mexico's trade agreements with the U.S. and Canada? With me now are two guests who will shed light on this matter. Roberta Jacobson, former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico and a founding partner of consultancy Dynamic America, and Neil Herrington, Senior Vice President of the Americas here at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Ambassador, let me start with you. Welcome to The Call.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Can you please set the stage for us? Why do so many people find these reforms so worrisome?
Well, as you noted, Jay, they include the election of judges and, importantly, all the way up to the Supreme Court, which, given the fact that the government has, obviously, Morena party has control of the entire executive branch and a supermajority in Congress, that means that the last remaining counterweight is taken away. And the dissolution virtually of the regulatory bodies by putting them into the executive. But you also have things like the preferential treatment of CFE, the government utility, virtually making it the state energy utility, frankly, and banning it from working with private companies. In addition, you've got the permanent militarization of the police, the Guardia Nacional, the National Guard, and an electoral reform, which really is not a priority anymore because AMLO got what he wanted through a simple law, which changed the way the votes were distributed subsequent to the election. So with 60% of the votes, Morena got 70 plus of the seats in Congress.
Now, some are saying these changes would bring us back to something similar to Mexico's period under one-party rule under PRI or PRI. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, and I think that's very true. I think this is a sort of a back to the future moment that returns Mexico, unfortunately, to one-party rule. It virtually eradicates for businesses a level playing field for foreign companies. The likelihood is that at least 5 of these reforms violate the USMCA, which begins its review, the successor agreement to NAFTA, which begins review this year, really, as they prepare for 2026. So the lack of certainty rather goes up dramatically. But we also know that, people like Ernesto Zedillo, the former president of Mexico, made a comment the other day in front of the International Bar Association. He has never commented on, in 20 years, commented on his country's situation because he feels this is so dire. So I think this is really very, very worrisome. for the future. And it, as one commentator who's very knowledgeable said to me, this ensures this Morena majority for at least 12 years. And his thought was it's going to take at least the current sexenio, that is 6-year term of Claudia Sheinbaum, and probably the next for opposition parties to regroup and potentially hold a majority to undo this.
Now, the judicial reforms seem to be a particular focus of the critics. But on the other hand, Claudia Sheinbaum, the president-elect, says the reforms will actually strengthen Mexico's courts. Is she right?
I think this is a clear case to me of where the cure is worse than the disease.
Mm.
The disease, if you will, is the situation of Mexico's court system, its judiciary right now. And there isn't any doubt in my mind that it is deeply flawed. When some of her advisors have said to me, surely you didn't want to, you weren't satisfied with the way it is, the answer is, of course not. And neither were many Mexicans. But I don't think this was the answer. And I think this is what we're going to see, is that the concentration of power and the politicization of the judiciary that will come with this, I think could end us up in a worse situation than we have now in terms of access to the courts, equal access to the courts, and this level playing field. So I think it's very worrisome.
Now, some have expressed hope that she'd be more moderate than AMLO once she takes over the presidency. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
There was a lot of belief, I think, and perhaps myself included, that she actually, and a lot of commentators thought she did not want the constitutional reforms, some of them, to go through. In particular, the judicial reform and the dissolution of the independent regulatory bodies, because she is going to be desperate for foreign investment.
Hmm.
The situation she inherits from AMLO economically is really fairly dire. There is a fiscal deficit that has grown enormously. The peso slid right after the election. It has stabilized, but we're not sure whether that could change again with more reforms. And most importantly, and this is very interesting, there is evidence that foreign investment from the U.S. has already begun to retrench. The leader of a business chamber, Coparmex, Jose Medina Mora, said yesterday that there is a definite demonstration of firms deciding to go to Texas or Honduras and not to Mexico, or just sitting on their money. The Wall Street Journal recently had a story about U.S. and other investments just holding until they see how these constitutional reforms play out. And I think that the most important thing in that is, if U.S. or Canadian investment does dry up, if you will, that is not going to be the case for the Chinese. They will be there to try and replace that. And long term, that is not good for either the North American trade agreements or for the United States, frankly.
If you've just joined us this morning, this is The Call, a regular video conversation in which we address the geopolitical issues of our time. Today we're discussing Mexico's reforms and their potential impact on business. Please hit the Q&A button if you have a question. Now, Ambassador, you were just talking about the United States and Canada. Mexico is our largest trading partner, with Canada a close second. Perhaps it's no surprise that the current ambassadors for both the U.S. and Canada have expressed these concerns to the Mexican administration. I'm just wondering if you could expound a little bit more on the stakes for Mexico's neighbors.
I think they are extremely high. Now I should say that, it's always a dilemma for an ambassador to decide, do I speak out publicly? Do I speak to a government behind the scenes? What's the most effective? But I do think that going public with something demonstrates, as this did, I think the concern, the level of concern. As I mentioned before, I think we need to sort of evaluate the extent to which other countries will invest if we don't, right? And that we also may see the undermining of our trade agreement, the USMCA. The likelihood is that in 2026, when this is reviewed, depending on the outcome of the US election, we could see a desire to abrogate the agreement, right? People say, but it was Trump's agreement. Surely he isn't going to leave it. I don't think we can be sure of that. If China is moving into Mexico in a big way, that could change people's views on either side of the aisle. It's one of the few bipartisan policies in Washington, which is to get tougher on China. But the other thing I think we need to understand is that there will be more investment disputes, right? If Mexico's courts are politicized and investors, foreign companies do not feel that they're getting a fair shake in Mexican courts, they will increasingly go either to arbitration within the USMCA or outside of it to ICSID and other fora. Those take very long to resolve. And there's no guarantee that Mexico would abide by the decision if these are constitutional changes that are then, if you will, nullified by an international arbitration. So there's a real struggle here on, can we continue the growth and the powerhouse that has been North America and even accelerate it through the nearshoring process that's been taking place, in which you have a country that is passing these kinds of restrictions or changes that may undermine that foreign investment. And I would also note there's one other thing we have to keep in mind. Mexico has other drags, if you will, on foreign investment, such as, for example, the fact that it's the highest crime rate ever recently, in the last year or two. And within that, truck hijackings have skyrocketed, and those are already affecting, potentially at the level potentially of 50 per day, some analysts evaluate, affecting companies like Amazon and Pepsi and Apple and Procter and Gamble. So it isn't that there are other factors that Mexico has that it hasn't resolved, and these seem like self-inflicted ones.
Okay, we have some questions that are coming in right now, but let me first turn to Neil Herrington, who leads our Americas practice here at the U.S. Chamber. Neil, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Jay. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate, and especially to join Roberta, who has just shown to everyone why she's one of the foremost Mexico experts in Washington.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. From the Chamber's perspective, what do these reforms mean for the business environment in Mexico? From as you're in touch with our members every day on this, I wonder, if you could just share what you see when you take the pulse of our membership.
Absolutely. I think you'll find that Roberta and I will probably mirror each other on a few themes, and I'm going to touch on one that she emphasized, and that is nothing undermines an investment climate like uncertainty. And that's what these reforms really have introduced for business in Mexico. As many on the call will know, at the Chamber, we have a decade-old initiative known as the Global Coalition for the Rule of Law. It started in the Americas and now covers 100 markets around the world, more than 100. And the coalition has established 5 key conditions that are critical for business success in a given market that relate to rule of law: transparency, predictability, accountability, stability, and due process. And in this context in Mexico, I think as Roberta was saying better than I can, when you have an independent judiciary and independent regulatory bodies that are called into question, you risk undermining all 5 of these factors. And again, I think as Roberta referenced, as many will recall, it was the courts and independent agencies, especially the courts, that served as the key counterweights to the current Mexican governments, to the current Mexican President AMLO's previous attempts to favor state-owned energy producers at the expense of the private sector. So the bottom line really is, when you have judicial systems and or regulators that lack independence, are underqualified, which is another critical issue here in the judiciary reforms, or can be subject to politicization, you only enhance the uncertainty, which can really very quickly translate into investment flight. You really have to have the requisite checks and balances that prevent the concentration of power in any one branch of government.
A really interesting question that just came in now. Is there an analog from other country transitions in the past that U.S. businesses can look to for insight on how to manage the potential changes in Mexico? Ambassador, I wonder if you could take a stab at that one.
Well, I mean, it's a great question. I don't know if there's an exact analog. Mexico's relationship with us is so special, if you will, the North American relationship. But the one that I've read most about in terms of the election of judges as being most similar to what Mexico has passed is unfortunately Bolivia, in which it did not go well. And things were highly politicized, and decisions that had been deemed unconstitutional, such as a third, I think, re-election for Evo Morales, were subsequently put to referenda, approved under this new system of elected judges, and he ran for and got a third term. So I think there's a, so far as I can tell, there are not great parallels that give us a lot of encouragement. The Mexicans have pointed out that we have elected judges in the United States, but honestly, it's really quite different. It's at the local level. It is, completely different than going all the way up through the federal judiciary to the Supreme Court.
Neil, I wonder if you concur, or if you see any other countries out there that might serve as some sort of a precedent that our members might be able to learn from.
It's interesting because Roberta and I are, I think, traveling in the same circles, and Bolivia really is the example from a judicial reform standpoint that everyone is pointing to. And as Roberta correctly said, Evo Morales ran for a third term and subsequently a fourth term in direct contravention of the Constitution. And that was enabled by a judiciary that he handpicked and was rubber stamped, that just rubber stamped his elections. And it led to a coup. And we're still in Bolivia in a situation where you have great political instability, which is translated to economic instability, a lot of uncertainty for our companies that work in Bolivia as well. So I do think that as political scientists look at parallels, that is the closest one.
It's a great point, if you don't mind, Jay, because what has happened in Bolivia beyond those initial rulings on Morales is you had a coup, you had the interim president then jailed in a way that really was politically motivated. But all this in a situation, as I've written, where you've got huge resources of critical minerals and things that the U.S. is extremely interested in and not paying enough attention to, in my view, in this hemisphere. But when you talk about things like lithium, the Bolivian case is not encouraging either in terms of the ability for U.S. companies to bid successfully on those rights and operate in those countries. And part of that is because the judiciary is so politicized and the government runs every branch of government.
We've got another question that came in, and this one is addressed to you, Ambassador. It's a long one, so I will try to paraphrase. We are seeing power shortages and power constraints across Mexico, and it threatens not only Mexico's digital transformation, but also nearshoring as advanced manufacturers heavily rely on interconnected data centers for their operations. Just wondering, our member was wondering, do you have any thoughts on the best way to navigate these issues?
Well, two things I would say. It's a great question. The power shortages across Mexico, from my experience, come from two sources, and these are the things that businesses, I think, have to be aware of. One is, frankly, a distorted market situation in Mexico, which will get more distorted with CFE, the utility, not just having 54% of the market, but potentially much more. And less room, I fear, for other producers. Now, I think on the upside, Sheinbaum, as an environmental scientist, if you will, she was a member of the UN team that won the Nobel Prize on climate change. And the renewable sector has begun to be opened up in Mexico, in particular wind and solar, which are not unproblematic politically, but they are obviously, they were repressed in Mexico in favor of fossil fuels for a long time. Now you have a much more everything, all of the above approach, which I think could be helpful. But the second feature that is absolutely necessary is water. And you have seen a dramatic drought across Mexico in the last few years. Something for the last couple of years, somewhere above 26 of 32 states were in moderate to severe drought last year. And this year, there has been considerably more rain. That is a good thing. But as we watch climate change, we need to be aware that the effect it has on energy production and on water are the two features that companies need to be concerned about. Now, there are states in Mexico, and this is where I would say companies need to focus at the state level, not just the federal level. But there are states in Mexico, such as Querétaro, which have done some very innovative things to try and continue to attract business. They're a very business-friendly state. But also to try, I'm not sure they've always been successful, and ensure there is water available and energy available, partly by trying to buy that from the federal government in advance of being asked by private companies for those services. But it is a very good question, and I think it's going to be the biggest challenge faced by companies in the next few years will be to ensure that remains the case, that they can navigate those features and enable them to expand and grow businesses. I'm hoping Sheinbaum will be cognizant of that, because she does need foreign investment, and she, I think, does prefer U.S. investment.
I'd be remiss if I didn't note that Claudia Sheinbaum will be Mexico's first woman as a president, and we should all be celebrating that. I just wonder, one of our members, rather, is wondering whether there are other key areas where the U.S. and Mexico continue to see eye to eye. And is there a baseline of shared values or shared priorities that might maintain the foundation of the relationship? And I'd like to throw that to both of you, starting with you, Ambassador.
Well, I would say I still think there are shared values, that there is a baseline. I am an eternal optimist. Nobody works in government for 31 years without being an optimist, right? Or you'd give up long before. But I think they're being tested. And they've been tested over the years, right? Whether it's a shared focus on cartels and drug trafficking and fentanyl, where I think we do share a lot of the same concerns, or climate change, or the judicial reforms and other reforms that we're seeing right now. I think undergirding that is a general sense in Mexico that North American partners, that is US and Canada, are the preferred partners. There is no doubt a DNA that is anti-American that occasionally comes out in Mexico. But overall, I think the desire to maintain our trade relationship, to grow it, and to be the preferred partner still exists. But we've got to find ways to build on it during a time of enormous stress. There's no doubt.
Neil, do you want to take a minute to weigh in on that as well? What do you see in terms of the baseline of positives here?
Absolutely, Jay. And I think if I could just go back very quickly to the previous question on energy access, really important, second to rule of law and to the investment climate, is in terms of issues for our members, is access to energy, and not just energy, but renewable resources, in the sense of so many of our think major automotive manufacturers with huge footprints in Mexico that are also subscribers to the Paris Accords and that have net zero commitments by 2040, 2050. Huge priority for them on access to renewable resources. And I absolutely share Roberta's optimism on Claudia Sheinbaum. She is a climate scientist. and also I think has a pragmatic side in this sense, as opposed to her predecessor, who really focused on empowering state-owned energy providers. On the second question, I share Roberta's optimism. I continue to believe that across the Mexican political spectrum, they understand the importance, certainly of U.S. investment, how it's lifted Mexican living standards since NAFTA 25 plus, almost 30 years ago. And I think understanding clearly that U.S. investment represents 50% of Mexico's total FDI. It supports directly and indirectly millions of jobs in Mexico. And I think there's this recognition across the Mexican political spectrum that we as North American allies are indispensable to Mexico's economy, and also a shared priority on ensuring that North America is the most competitive region economically in the world.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there, as it's time for us to let our audience members get on with the rest of their day. Let me thank Roberta Jacobson, former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico and founding partner of consultancy Dinamica Americas. Ambassador, thank you.
Thank you so much, and for your members.
Also, a shout out to Neil Herrington, who advocates both the U.S. and Mexican governments on behalf of our members. Neil, thanks for dropping by today.
Thank you, Jay. It's been a pleasure.
If you'd like to reach out to either of our guests, please find their emails under the resource bar at the bottom of your screen. Finally, a warm thank you for you, our members, for joining us today. If you have a theme you would like us to cover, please feel free to reach out to us at the email on the screen, globalintel@uschamber.com. We are planning many shows in the coming weeks and months, and we welcome your suggestions and feedback. This has been The Call, brought to you by the Global Intelligence Desk of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington, asking the right questions to navigate uncertain times.